And it's interesting here, it says the first blue law, although not called that at the time, was enacted in colonial Virginia in 1610, and it mandated church attendance at both morning and afternoon services on Sundays. A first-time offender lost his provision and allowance for a whole week.
Wow.
This is making me think of buying and selling. You cannot buy or sell because we're going to, apparently they had a system where there was an allowance given, and if you weren't seen at church on Sunday morning and evening, you had your allowance cut off for a whole week. The second offense, in addition to losing his allowance, would be whipped.
What?
And a third violation was supposedly punished by death, though there's debate over whether accounts of early blue laws were in some cases exaggerated or not. So you think about this prophetically, you're enforcing worship, like Revelation says, with the penalty of losing your allowance or ability to buy and sell, and persecution and death. Exactly what Revelation talks about.
Welcome back, everyone, to LED Live. Today we are discussing politics. Now, don't click away yet. This is going to actually be exciting. We are discussing Project 2025, which is kind of like this massive document that a Republican think tank has come up with. And we are going to show you how this actually is found in biblical prophecy. So, quick disclaimer, we are not discussing our own political views, we're not endorsing one party or the other, or putting any party down, we are just discussing the facts. So with us, we have James. He has a YouTube channel called Biblical Hope, and you are the religious liberty leader at your church. So you've brought this presentation for us today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. So Project 2025 is not exactly something new. The Heritage Foundation's been doing this for a little while. So going back to the 1980s, back during the Reagan era, you had their first mandate for leadership, which was presented to Ronald Reagan, and around 60% of the mandate for leadership's 2,000 plus proposals were implemented at the end of Reagan's first year in office. And following that time period, there's actually been several mandates that have been presented by the Heritage Foundation since, trying to establish conservative policies in United States culture.
Yeah, so that's kind of what Project 2025 is, right? It's like this big document that there's this push for, if Donald Trump specifically, mostly of all the Republican
Party.
Yeah, but I think they mostly want Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
If he gets into power, they kind of want to lobby to get these policies into place.
Yeah, so this is mandate number 9, and it's a 900-page comprehensive guide with over 70 plus conservative organizations that are supporting. So if you think about, State Street, or if you think about Young Americans for Liberty, there's a lot of conservative think tanks that are behind this, not just the Heritage Foundation. And one of the things it does is it licenses a swift takeover of the executive branch under a maximalist version of the unitary executive theory. Now, what does that mean? If you think about it today, one of the things we're seeing more common in politics is the idea that the president can write an executive order and make a change in the executive branch very freely. But if we start abolishing things like the independence of the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission or the Communications Commission, it allows the United States president to exert more power. And
to become a dictator.
Exactly.
Right?
Wow.
Yeah. So they're even taking it so far as the Washington Post noted that they're planning possibly to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807 to deploy the military for domestic law enforcement, which, if you think about it, what a power grab that is. I mean, it's definitely something significant that they're planning on doing.
So this last point, Insurrection Act of 1807, is that basically saying that they can enforce martial law, or what is that?
Yeah, it's taking it to the point where, if there's any dissent, if there's any, violence, or if there's any opposition to this kind of takeover and power play, that they have the legal authority to go in and intervene as far as that goes.
That's scary.
So yeah, there's a lot of people that are kind of afraid for this, that something bad could be happening. And how fast are they going to do this? Well, they're taking a plan here that in the first 180 days of office, they want to implement this plan. So this is something that's going to be very rapid. Yeah. So, and there's 4 pillars that will collectively pave the way for an effective conservative administration. It's not just this 900-page document, but there's actually a presidential administration academy. There's a personnel database that they're looking to establish, as well as an idea that whatever the president says, in God we trust, that can be moved forward. And so part of their 4th pillar is actually to implement a sort of religious element to this, that whatever the president says, in God we trust, or a reference to divine authority there, that they can go ahead and try and implement as part of one of the pillars of this project.
Wow.
What do you guys think about that? Is that something we want to go as a direction in the United States?
I don't know. I mean, we're considered a Christian nation and things like that, but the only thing I know is if the government makes any kind of rules or laws that contradict or are contrary to the biblical standards or God's commandments, that we shouldn't obey those laws. If you have somebody in there that's saying, I'm implementing these laws because the Bible says so, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, there is a thing in this country called separation of church and state. And we can see in history where the church and state were together, right? Where for years, the Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican were basically ruling the countries, the nations. And you see how much damage that caused, right? It's millions of Christian lives lost, millions of people who truly wanted to genuinely follow the scriptures, and they were killed for it. And that's why the U.S. was founded as separation of church and state. And this is really bringing that back.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought out that point, because, one of the things that we find when we go back to the history of the Heritage Foundation, which is, again, touts themselves as America's premier conservative think tank, it was actually founded in 1973 by Paul Rehrich, Edwin Fulner, and Joseph Coors. But who are these guys? Paul Rehrich was a Catholic. His religious beliefs significantly influenced his political activism. You guys might have heard of the moral majority back in the day. So it was an idea of advancing conservative Christian values, where Edwin Fulner, he was educated in Jesuit schooling, also a devout Roman Catholic. And then, of course, we have an evangelical on board as well. So there's this idea of Protestants reaching across what was historically a big gulf and joining hands with the Roman hierarchy. And the problem that every American ought to have with that is that if you go back to the encyclicals like Quanta Cura in 1864, there was this idea that religious liberty or liberty of conscience and worship is each man's personal right. That's insanity.
Whoa.
They think that your right to worship God free from coercion in a constituted society is insanity.
Man.
I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this before we start filming this. That means that anybody who wants to have a different religion should have the same right. And we as Christians should grant them that same right. If you want to be a Muslim, you should have that right. Because God allows for free will. Now, at the end, of course, there will be a judgment, etc. But God allows for free will. And that should be upheld.
I love the idea that true love, true worship can only come from the heart. The idea of the new covenant is all about worshiping God and having his law written on our heart. And so where I see a problem with this is chapter 16, under the Department of Labor. There's this idea, and I'm reading here from the mandate, that God ordained the Sabbath as a day of rest, and until very recently, the Judeo-Christian tradition sought to honor that mandate by moral and legal regulation of work on that day. However, a shared day off makes it possible for families and communities to enjoy time off together rather than atomized individuals. They say that the communal day of rest has eroded under the pressures of consumerism and secularism, especially for low-income workers. So here's where the proposal comes in. The idea that the Fair Labor Standards Act, federal law, should be modified so that workers be paid time and a half off for hours worked on the Sabbath. So we have this union of church and state here, and the day would default to Sunday.
Why?
Well, that was the big argument back in the for years, back during like the Protestant Reformation, and going back in history. You're looking at something that some people state there is over 1,000 years of tradition, but there are some others who disagree with that and point that the biblical mandate is from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. So there's some disagreement here, and there's an exception clause where they state, well, for those who have a sincere observance or a sincere obligation of the Sabbath from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown, the obligation would transfer to that period instead. So we'll give you an exception if you're a Jew, but that's as far as they take it. Can you guys think of any other religions that might maybe hold to a day other than Saturday?
I think the Muslims, right? They worship on Friday at the mosque.
Yeah. Although I think in the writings of the Quran, they recognize the Sabbath, but they don't want to be associated with the Jews. And so they pick a different day for prayers. What's fascinating about this is if you read this document, and I've read through this section because it mentions the Sabbath 9 times in the document and 900 pages, and it's all within like a couple of paragraphs within a page of each other. They realize that they can't make this change very easily, so they resort to forcing the businesses and hitting them in their pocketbook. Like, okay, so if you're going to make people work on the Sabbath because you're all greedy consumerist capitalists, then we're going to make you pay the workers more.
Wow.
Right? And in my mind, the way that works out is obviously you have the exception clause. And so they can kind of shift the workforce around a little bit, at least in the beginning, right? Like, okay, well, those people that don't want to, that can't work on the Sabbath, we'll shift them to Sunday so we can keep open on those days. The people that are working on Sunday, we'll shift them to another day or whatever. But then I also think over time, this is going to get tighter, right? Mm-hmm. They're going to squeeze, and pretty soon it will be basically like no weekend work, right?
Well, the big thing that I could see with that too is this looks friendly in having an exception clause here.
It does.
But I could easily see maybe a smaller business who doesn't have the resources to pay the extra money, or I could even see somebody from another religion coming and bringing a lawsuit and stating this exception right here violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
Right.
So what you're doing is you're privileging those who maybe want to, don't go by the default of Sunday and go with Saturday. You're privileging them and you're giving them an exemption. And that's denying the rights of everybody else to equal protection under the law.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then I think what will happen is once it squeezes, I think to compensate, businesses will shift their hours because they're still interested in making money. So you shift your workforce and you start opening a little later and you close a little later and you have an overlap in the middle. So like take some place like Sam's Club, right? They're not open 24/7. Maybe they open at 8. So they'll start opening at 6 or 7. And if they close at 8, they'll be open till like 9 or something, right? And just make those expansive hours because those people aren't going to be able to go at their normal times. And if they're at work, they can't go while they're at work, right? So they're going to have extended hours to go either before or after.
Wow.
What happened with Chick-fil-A again? There was like an issue with them being closed on Sunday, and there was some politician that attacked them for it.
Really?
Yeah, that was I think one of the Senate leaders who went after them for that. And there's this idea that they're being denied religious liberty as far as that goes there. And so he's promised to come back and fight for them. And so there's this idea that, maybe we need to come and protect businesses like Chick-fil-A with a law like this.
That's really interesting. So, like, I wonder, I'm just curious if this was an issue of, well, they just don't want to be open on Saturday or Sabbath. Well, then would they have been left alone? You know, as in like nobody would fight for them. But when it comes to Sunday, you see the opposite happening. Like the politicians want to stand up for them because they're keeping Sunday.
Well, they have the same values.
Yeah, so, that's actually been an issue that's been brought up before the United States Supreme Court recently as well.
Postal worker.
Yeah, postal worker, Groff versus DeJoy. And of course, there was a Walgreens pharmacist a few years back who brought a similar case for Saturday, but was denied hearing before the Supreme Court. But it was the Sunday keeper who got heard and ultimately protected.
That's so interesting.
Do you know why his case got to the Supreme Court? Do you know what his issue was?
This postal worker?
Yeah. He was having to work on Sunday, and he indicated that the reason he was having to work on Sunday, the reason the post office was requiring him to work on Sunday, is because Amazon was shipping out so many packages, it was hard for the Postal Service to keep up with normal business hours of operation. So they extended that into the weekend so people could get their packages. So here's where you see that consumerism, commercialism, and all that playing in. Like, I can't even get a break, can't be off, because people are too greedy.
Yeah.
This idea is getting much more prevalent today. This was Donald Trump's appointee to the administrative state. And you can see here the Administrative Conference of the United States, Adrian Vermeule. He's a Harvard law professor. One of the things that he's been tweeting here recently is, what exactly do post-liberals want to do? And the answer here is to ban porn, ban positivism, Sabbath laws, economic solidarity and corporatism, and stewardship of nature. You can think of that in maybe the encyclical Laudato Si, for example. In addition, Sohrab Omari, writing for Deseret News, he was asked the question, would you support restored Sabbath laws and more broadly public activism towards policies of this nature? He says, that's my jam, man, definitely. He used to be the editor for the New York Post, a co-op ed. And so we're seeing this idea of Sabbath laws becoming much more prevalent today. But
what is a post-liberal? To me, a liberal is somebody that wants to, I don't know, they seem more liberal. It's in the title, but what is a post-liberal?
Well, I think of a post-liberal as, basically their allusion towards the culture in the United States is getting burnt out on the extremism that we've seen.
So this is somebody who's experienced where liberalism leads.
Yeah.
And so it's like a pendulum swing.
Exactly.
And right now there's a lot of liberalism out there, and we're seeing the world in chaos. I mean, they're trying to... It's called pedophilia, sexual orientation, and things like that. So we're getting to the point where we're like, okay, something needs to change. So why would this guy be in favor of Sabbath laws, and what exactly is a Sabbath law?
Well, perhaps we can hear it from himself. I've got a little clip here to play. This is from Jonathan Berry, who was the editor for Chapter 16 of Project 2025, which talked about the Sabbath.
But there are implications for social conservative values across many issues. One of the interesting proposals that you've laid out in Project 2025 handbook from Heritage is stuff around the Sabbath. What are some of the ideas that you have there?
Yes. So this is, it sounds controversial. In many respects, it is a return to something that basically always everyone ever had. And it's specifically the idea of encouraging Sabbath rest through discouraging commerce on the Sabbath. The proposal that's in our book is amending the basic federal overtime law, Fair Labor Standards Act, to require that overtime be paid for all work done on the Sabbath.
Interesting.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't think I don't think Congress has the authority to mandate like a national closing on the Sabbath. That was always a state decision to do that. But let me add, it was always a state decision to do that.
They did it.
and yeah, I'm not saying this practice was uniform, homogenous, whatever, but very, very widely spread, and only recently in the last few decades have most states moved away from this. So this is, I think this is about as far as the federal government could properly go in this space. But it would be an encouragement and inducement to rest, but really to kind of coordinate commercial activity for the other 6 days of the week, which is as long as we've had Sabbatarian civilization, beginning in Israel and continuing into Christendom. This is something that's been increasingly a part of the rhythm of civic life. Most importantly, for people to have space to worship and honor God, and secondly, to have times of communal rest with their families and with their communities.
Yeah, he states that it's never been federal, but there have definitely been pushes.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd bring that up. And the thing is, you listen to him, and it's like, it sounds so good, right?
Yeah.
But then it's always framed for the majority. Like, what about the minority person that doesn't go along with that? Like, they're always going to suffer.
Yeah,
right?
And we've seen, and I think you'll talk about this. We've seen Sunday laws put into place many times. This is not new, where it's mandated. Well, you need to rest on Sunday, and spend time with your family, and hopefully that makes you go to church. And by the way, you should probably work on Saturday or Sabbath. And to me, it's like, why? Like, if you're so all about religion and Christianity, then why do you have to enforce people to worship, right? That's really what it is. It's forcing people to worship on the day that you think they're supposed to worship, instead of allowing people to have their own relationship with God, their own conscience, their own conversion experience, and say, you know what, I've studied the Bible, and this is what I believe is true, and I want to follow the scriptures.
These guys aren't alone. I've got a few more clips here I was going to show you. This is Dr. Chad Pecknold from the Catholic University of America, and he says it a little bit more explicitly.
So here I want to propose, as a bulwark, as a make-weight, as a condition for addressing material questions in a non-materialist way, a public orientation to God then reflected where? Reflected in concrete ways, in national holidays, in civic liturgies, in laws, indeed Sabbath laws, Sunday laws, that would require a cessation of what? Commerce.
Now, if you guys go to National Conservatism, which they're big liberal think tank as well, one of the books that they're promoting recently is The Case for Christian Nationalism by a PhD author, Stephen Wolfe. He's been interviewed here recently. I'm sure you guys might have seen some of his clips here, but I've got a couple of them here that highlight the direction that he's willing to go with this.
He's kind of crazy.
Right? Let's take a look.
So how do you order people, how do you order Christians to eternal life? Well, you, in an outward way, you do what you can so that they can worship God. And the church can administer word and sacrament. And how, in particular, how would you do that? You'd have Sabbath laws, and Sabbath laws are not simply to punish violations of Fourth Commandment, but to provide the conditions in which people can worship God without distraction. That's the purpose.
That make it sound so good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but he takes it a little bit farther.
The best critique is basically that what you're doing is it's a de facto privileging of Christianity, because which religion has the Sabbath on Sunday? Well, it's Christianity, and so you're not doing it on Saturday. You're not doing it. So you're explicitly saying this is a Christian land, and we're gonna all force you to obey some sort of Christian. And so that's the best critique, and I would just say. That's exactly what it does. I would just one of those things, I'm not going to reject their objection. I'm just going to affirm it. Yes.
Wow, we're forcing you to become Christian.
Mm-hmm.
This sounds like the Dark Ages.
I know, like this has happened before. where it's like you become a Christian or your head gets chopped off. I mean, it happened in the Roman times when Constantine became emperor of Rome, and he said, you know what? I think that the best religion is actually Christianity. So everybody become Christian, and Christianity became the most popular religion, and it was what got you to the top in politics or whatever you did. Therefore, you became a Christian by name, right? But the Christians were, again, people were forced to adopt Christianity, and you could see how fake people's religion was. It wasn't genuine.
Yeah, nothing forced is real or genuine.
Yeah.
And it's never been good. It's God's laws are for us to keep out of love, out of free will, not by death decree by some king like Nebuchadnezzar, right? Was it Nebuchadnezzar or his son that who was it?
Nebuchadnezzar did it. Yeah. I mean, many of them did.
He threw the Daniel he threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire and saw that their God was real. He said, okay, nobody bows to my image. Everybody bows to God or you get cut in pieces. It's never good. You don't force people to worship God with the punishment of death if you don't.
And I think that's the question of where is this going? Like you were saying, Keith, like, will it just turn into a big snowball effect where eventually it's like, well, if you don't want to worship on Sunday, then, I'm just saying.
It's not going to stop there. History already tells us that we've gone down this road. And it's very interesting. A couple clips back, the guy's like, well, this has never happened. Congress has never had the authority to do this on a national level.
Oh, wow.
But then in 1888, with the Blair Bill, you had exactly that. And it was this close to passing. Essentially, it came down to the testimony or rebuttal of one guy against Senator Blair. His name was A.T. Jones. And his arguments, I think he was a history professor, were good enough to keep that at bay. But essentially, everything's already like on the books, been there, done that. We got blue laws all over this country, even though they're not enforced.
Yeah.
And so we're just like a hair's breadth away from this all over again.
First time I ever heard of a blue law, for anybody that doesn't know, I lived in Georgia for a while and I used to drink alcohol and you could not buy alcohol on Sunday. And I was like, always so mad. I was like, what is this? Like, I can't buy alcohol on Sunday, but that was part of it. They've gotten rid of it since then, but.
Yeah, I'm from the Netherlands, and I remember growing up, there were no shops open on Sunday, and eventually it started opening up. But then I'm assuming up until this day, at least when I was younger, in my early 20s, this is what was happening, is that if you worked on Sunday, you got double the pay. So I mean, it's everywhere.
One of the things that they tried to do to get this bill passed back in 1888 was there was a reformer in the Women's National Temperance Union, and she wrote a letter to Seventh-day believers proposing in substance that if they would help them to secure a Sunday law, they would exempt them from its penalties. So that exemption clause, that if you have a sincere day that's different from Sunday, on Saturday, we'll give you an exemption in Project 2025. That's been tried before. They've tried to do this. But the big concern that I have as we go to the United States Constitution, Saturday is not mentioned, but if you go to Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2, there is a discussion about bills that are returned to the president within 10 days, Sundays excepted. It shall have been presented to him, the same shall be a law in like manner as he had signed it. So there's this idea within the United States Constitution that Sunday is protected. And this has already been tested in Maryland versus McGowan, the idea of whether or not a Sunday law can stand up to the United States Constitution. And when they argue it for secular purposes, like whether it's the welfare of citizens or the welfare of the environment, those kinds of things allow them to escape the idea that this is a religious law. Yeah. And so it becomes a Trojan horse that sneaks in, when really all it is it's a religious law, and it's always been that way.
Clip from the last guy you showed. What was his name again?
Stephen Wolfe.
Yeah, he's one that I watched an interview with that he was saying exactly that. It's like it wasn't, the whole argument is not framed in a religious liberty context. It's framed in a social, what's the word I'm looking for?
Economic?
It wasn't economic, civil, like a social civil argument completely. It's like they're like saying like, no, we just need to leave religion aside here. We're not talking about religious things. We're coming at this from a totally different angle and for different reasons. And that's why it gains traction.
You know, I was thinking that example that you mentioned of Nebuchadnezzar, that's so true in that I believe true religion is something that has to come from the heart.
Yeah.
And the government can never coerce that. You can never change somebody's heart through outward external force. It has to be the Spirit of God moving within you.
Right.
Yep.
And
there's other countries too where it's like if you visit North Korea or something, you have to bow to this image and put a rose on the statue. You think people are really loving this person that they're being forced to bow to? You really get a resentment for that person.
one of the big arguments they had back in the day is did allowing extra time off actually promote morality? And one of the things that they found is, you would get society to have a day off, but that didn't necessarily mean that they would use it for the right purposes.
Right.
People would go out and get drunk, go riot, go do all kinds of things because they had free time on their hands and were using that time in a way that they shouldn't.
Yeah.
So it doesn't promote the morality of society at all.
It also doesn't. I mean, I see the argument about commerce and stuff, but it doesn't stop people from shopping online. They can go and then spend the whole day on Amazon, or they can be like, "Oh, I got all this free time. I can go out and watch porn or whatever." It doesn't solve any of that. Like you said, people can still go out and drink. Of course, if the blue laws are active, that probably wouldn't be happening so much. A lot of states is like you can't buy it until noon or something like that.
Unless the government cracks down real bad and it's like there's no internet on Sunday either.
Right, it's just a black
in
screen.
China, I didn't think you could really control the internet, but you can. In China, they ban, you couldn't search Tank Man. I don't know if you've seen the famous picture of a man standing in front of a line of tanks, and he was taking a stand, but you can't search that in China. It's banned. So there's ways to for the government to control what you look at.
I don't think the U.S.
I hope not.
stand for that. The people, if you just shut off the internet,
What are we
I think that
supposed to
would
do?
create some
Yeah.
some big waves real fast.
I did. I have seen the blue laws before, and I had looked it up before. And there's this website, a secular website called Today I Found Out. Feed your brain. Anyone can look this up. It says, "What are blue laws?" And it's interesting here. It says the first blue law, although not called that at the time, was enacted in colonial Virginia in 1610, and it mandated church attendance at both morning and afternoon services on Sundays. A first-time offender lost his provision and allowance for a whole week.
Wow.
This is making me think of buying and selling. You cannot buy or sell because we're going to, apparently they had a system where there was an allowance given, and if you weren't seen at church on Sunday morning and evening, you had your allowance cut off for a whole week. The second offense, in addition to losing his allowance, would be whipped.
What?
And a third violation was supposedly punished by death, though there's debate over whether accounts of early blue laws were in some cases exaggerated or not. So you think about this prophetically, you're enforcing worship, like Revelation says, with the penalty of losing your allowance or ability to buy and sell, and persecution and death, exactly what Revelation talks about.
Dude, that is crazy. And the fact that this has happened before within the United States, that's supposed to be the land of the free. This is literally our freedom being taken away from us.
This was the 1600s. I'm not sure. Colonial Virginia, was that the beginning of?
Yeah, in United States
American
history, that's one of the first instances that you have. Going back to the maybe the Reformation era, there were councils that made decrees against subgroups like the Waldenses or others that for the crime of heresy and other similar crimes that they could not have any commerce or any business. And there was even some discussion about William the Conqueror back in the day. Roger Hovden talks about it in some of the annals of English history, where there was anybody who was found disobedient to the apostolic see or the papal hierarchy, you couldn't buy or sell.
Wow.
So
the Bible says history repeats itself. There's no new thing under the sun. You see, like, this has happened in the Dark Ages. This happened in the United States. And some people, I think, you guys are crazy. Like, what makes you think we're headed in the same direction? But this is religious freedom being attacked. And we're not sitting here saying like, oh, well, like the Sabbath keepers are being attacked. We're saying this is an issue because if you are a Christian, whether you worship on Sabbath or Sunday or what other day, this is your religious freedom that's under attack.
Yeah, and this, like he said, this Heritage Foundation has been around for a while. I mean, they're not the new kids on the block. And if you look at their website and read through their documentation, they don't care who the conservative president is. They really don't. As far as they're concerned, he's just a figurehead, and they're the ones kind of running the show because they have every single area of public policy outlined, and to tell Congress and the president, this is how the law should be written.
Well, it seems like no matter red or blue, or conservative or liberal, this is a good idea in their eyes. It's like the Republicans are going to say, yeah, it's great, we're getting the country back to God, but the liberals, they can say, yeah, it's going to save the environment and things like that. So it's like a win-win the way it's set up.
Yeah,
unless you're against
I think it would be harder to push this if you had a liberal president and a liberal cabinet, because
depends on how you spin
there's
it.
certain things in there that, yeah, they would be for, but by and large, I think they wouldn't be as likely. And they specifically state, like conservative president, we need conservative people in office. So if you're not on that train, they're probably less likely to work with you, would be my guess, unless they're just ultimatum.
I think one of the concerns that I would have about Project 2025 as a whole, though, is how they have framed it in terms of banning porn or framing it in the sense that this is for the benefit of the family, is that there's going to be a lot of people who see the chaos of today, who see the rampant immorality in America and are fed up and looking for a solution. And for them, this is going to look like a solution, but they're not going to realize the other side to it.
And I think those are the people that are not voting. They're kind of like this silent, I don't know if they're a majority, but there's like a silent group of people. If you look at the polls, like most people in America, I don't even know if it's the majority really vote. Maybe that's been up in more recent terms, but by and large, I don't think the majority of people get out to the polls.
Yeah.
And so that's where it really gets its power is, when you really get to people's heartstrings and pull on these conservative values that they're just tired of seeing in the news but never done anything about. I think that's where you see.
I think people are just losing hope, losing faith in the government. They're like, what's the point of voting? It's like, choose the best evil, the greater of the two.
I remember reading in the annals of, or some historical records about ancient Babylon, that when Nebuchadnezzar set up the image as a religious test, that there was a lot of chaos going on in his kingdom at that time, that there had even been hand-to-hand fighting within the palace. And so there was this idea that to bring peace to a fractured empire, there needs to be this religious test that brings everybody together, and it presents a question of whose side are you on? We're facing that in the nation today, where there's a massive divide. And I think people are looking for, how do we find a way forward so that we don't completely crumble as a nation?
Yeah. Did you see there is an alternative view in this document as well? Not that it necessarily represents the view they want to push, but they basically contrast and say, according to, there's the one point of view is FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, that we should encourage, making it more expensive for employers. Other conservatives, they say, believe that the government's role is to protect the free exercise of religion by eliminating barriers as opposed to erecting them. And so they do recognize that not everybody thinks that way, but they're also not as apt to promote that viewpoint as well. That's not what they're going for.
I think the concern too is that this is framed as just the first opening shot, if you will. So what we're seeing here could easily change over time. and could easily get much more serious in terms of what the demand is. So he talked about, well, I don't know that we can necessarily demand federally that every business be shut down, but that could change over time. And I think that this demonstrates the flexibility of and the fluidity of the push currently.
But during COVID, there were only certain types of businesses that were allowed to be open. So you see that same track with the ability to be set up. It's like, okay, well, all the healthcare has to be open, all the emergency services have to be open, utilities have to be open, that kind of thing. It's like, boil it down to like what's necessary for infrastructure of society. Everything else, close it down. And we've seen this in Europe actually for years. I was in Romania at the end of 2023 and the beginning of 2024. And I was talking about this Project 2025 with some of them because they have their eyes on American politics. They want to see what's going on and stuff. And they said, actually, like this kind of stuff has been happening in Europe for 20 years.
Yeah.
There's like all kinds of places you will not find shops open to shop at.
What is their reasoning? Is it a Christian thing too?
Yeah, I mean, same kind of thing. I mean, it's the same kind of influence, the same kind of political leanings. It's about the protection of society and the family and all of that. And of course, Europe is more probably heavily Catholic, at least in its deep roots, because you have several countries that go back and identify with Catholicism for thousands of years. So, or at least, 1,500, 1,600 years. So they're more likely to latch onto that. And you even see it in certain cultures. So for example, and I confirmed this with Alex when he was working here. If I go and speak somewhere and it's largely a Hispanic group, okay, I'm pastor, and it doesn't matter what my credentials are, like pastor. And you watch, and all those people, they look up to the pastor, right? The pastor is the man. Guy can hardly do no wrong. Like it's pastor this, pastor that, right? Not saying the pastor doesn't have his place, but it's way more emphasized in their culture. Why is that? Well, they have Catholic roots, and those roots were always like the priest,
right?
Like, it was almost like society revolved around the priest. Like you go to the priest for this, you go to the priest for that, and whatever the priest says, this is the thing. And that's it's translated down even when they become Protestant. And so you still have some of that in these other countries.
Wow.
So one of the things that I think you've got a point there that I'm seeing in a lot of their literature is this idea of synchronized rest. The idea that we all need to be unified and on the same page. You don't have that if you got half the country or maybe even a small minority who says, no, we're going to keep it, on Saturday instead of Sunday. And what about those Muslims? Well, one of the things that the New York Times had this last year was Dubai had started shifting to where they were going to start closing on Sundays and start realigning themselves or aligning more with the West. And so there's a change. There's even some Turkish shop mall owners who are starting to request specifically Sunday to be protected by law. You also see this in Malaysia as well, which you would think of as, how is that a Christian nation? But yet some of their political leaders are starting to demand Sunday be protected as well.
Same with Israel. They're starting to cave too.
Yeah, Jerusalem Times has been talking about that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, they're starting to be like, well, and where it all hits is economy. It's like if you're missing out on that, that day, it really hits people. So even some of the Jews are starting to,
compromise,
at least intellectually entertain some of those ideas. So, and that's what I think of as like Seventh-day Adventists aren't the only ones that are like this. You have Seventh-day Baptists, you have Jews, you have Muslims, you have Seventh-day Church of God, you have all kinds of denominations or groups that have a different Sabbath, if you will, than Sunday. What about them? But again, they're the minority.
I think that anybody watching this has to see that this is not a small issue, right? This is happening across the world, even in Arabic and Jewish nations. I mean, there's something up with this.
You know, guys, one of the things that I've been noticing is this seems to be an increasingly popular discussion and talking point here. One of the individuals referenced here is actually Sohrab Omari. He's the editor of the New York Post. And
Says Wall Street Journal?
Yes,
Wow.
Wall Street Journal, what we've lost in rejecting the Sabbath. And they talked here about how we need to kind of return to this idea of Sunday being protected by rest. But, you know, even businesses of today, like Bed Bath & Beyond, are referencing the idea of Sunday relaxation in some of their ads. You have this being a talking point not only for the Wall Street Journal, but for Deseret News. It's interesting that during COVID, this was a talking point that I saw to the tune of probably 500 plus articles that I was seeing in various languages around the world, where you're seeing in many countries, you see a push this direction. We can see this in Puerto Rico. We can see this in the United States. Even some Baptist speakers are pushing for Sunday as a day of rest. The idea of Piggly Wiggly perhaps following the Chick-fil-A standard.
Wow.
And, you know, it comes from countries that you wouldn't necessarily expect. For example, Malaysia. In Malaysian news, Hana Yo, who's one of the Malaysian politicians, was stating that Sunday should be made a day of rest and family day.
So they just kind of promote it as family day, you know, not a worship day.
Yeah. You see it in Taiwan as well. There's petitions being put out there that there's a right or rest day or day off once a week. Samoa, you see a push for that as well, that they want to ban Sunday trading. And some, you know, here in the United States, we see how individuals like Adrian Vermeule, who again, he's Donald Trump's appointee to the Administrative Conference, we can see him retweeting ideas from Sohrab Omari and others that blue laws are very pro-worker and pro-family. So unions specifically are some of the main driving power players to get these enacted. And of course, this has been very popular in Germany, where Sundays on the construction site, there were some individuals that broke the basic law, Article 139 of the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, and they were fined 1,200 euros.
Wait,
So-
they were fined for what? If they worked on Sunday?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And, you know, in Germany, of course, the unions right there have been really big in getting these enacted. You got the Verdi Union, you've got Uni Europa, you've got CESI, several different trade unions that are headed this direction and advocating before the members of European Parliament. Of course, during COVID, we saw people being booked in certain regions of India for violating Sunday lockdowns. The Mississippi governor declared Sunday a statewide day of fasting and prayer.
Oh.
You know, of course, Matthew McConaughey, it's getting very popular in Hollywood as well in certain sectors. And in France, the idea of a Lord's Day Act that was previously nullified by the Supreme Court, there was a petition that was delivered to the French National Assembly to get that federal Lord's Day Act reenacted in Quebec. So it's getting super popular.
Yeah, this is worldwide.
There's more on the Puerto Rico Sunday closures as well. We have closures being pushed in Italy. We see, of course, in China, a hefty fine. This was actually over in Greece. There was a butcher who opened his shop on Sunday, and he had to pay 3,000 euros.
That is crazy.
So, yeah. So, one of the things that I found interesting here, though, is in the United States, there was a newspaper called the Union Springs Herald. And this particular section right here, I found interesting. They stated that, you know, the Sunday blue laws are not unconstitutional or discriminatory, and this opens a way for the present confused, contradictory local and state laws to be replaced by a national law that will standardize the enforcement of Sunday blue laws all over America.
Whoa.
So they want something federal here, closing all across Europe, and you can see over in some of the movements that are gathering to enact Sunday laws that it's coming together of, you know, federations of trade unions, churches, bankers, so financial structure here getting on board. And you can see how, you know, the environmentalists like Green Party Switzerland And a lot of unions, the Methodist Church, everybody's coming together and trying to head this direction. You have them pushing for initiatives like Zero Carbon Sunday, restoring a universal weekly rest day for the human fraternity and the planet.
I find this so interesting. I remember it was probably still during COVID or a little bit after. I watched the nature documentary. And it was specifically about what happened in nature during COVID when everything was shut down. And I remember they said in that documentary that, it would be good for nature and for the environment to have one day of rest a week.
Yeah.
They didn't say Sunday, but one day of rest a week. And here they're talking specifically about Sunday. Why not any other day of the week? Why Sunday for the sake of the environment?
Yeah, so even here in the United States, Fox News asked a question here about a year ago. Look at the number of likes and reactions. 24, almost 25,000, 7,000 shares. This was Fox New York. Should all stores close on Sunday to allow staff a day off to recuperate?
Wow. And they're not even spinning this for COVID. It's just in general.
So this was Peru right here that was announcing in the middle of COVID on Sunday, no one is allowed to leave home.
What is it about Sunday? I mean, I get it. COVID, they were trying to shut people, stay in your homes and all that kind of thing. But now these articles, it's like just on Sunday. That's when COVID's out there. Don't spread it on Sunday.
Right. Yeah. Like COVID is no respecter of persons.
Or days of the week.
So why Sunday, like you said? And why do we see this over and over and over and over again? It's not like Sunday and then, Thursday and Wednesday. No, it's just Sunday. That's crazy.
Yeah, this has been going on. There's a push now with Crisis Magazine to bring back the blue laws. In Geneva, there's referendums against the Sunday opening. We see even in other nations as well, like the Inuits, where there was a reference to naming Sunday as a day of rest. And we can see at one point, if I go to Google News and Google this during the height of COVID, it's just article after article after article. The EU bishops with Comacy, we can see that they were pushing it as well. And of course, Verdi, which is that German union, has been quite active in demanding that as well.
I just think it's interesting that they keep talking about Sunday rest. And they do throw the Bible out there. So when did this become a day of rest, according to the Bible? I mean, why is it Sunday? I mean, we know that Sabbath means 7, it means rest, but we keep seeing the Sunday thing.
Well, it's interesting. If you go back to the early church in the time of St. Jerome and Lady Paula, one of the things that there was a bishop in the 17th century, Bishop White, who actually noted that in the early church, with Lady Paula, he said the most devout Christians did ordinary work on Sundays. So Lady Paula was out there, after they had a Sunday meeting, they'd go out there and work. They didn't rest on Sunday.
Yeah.
There is no biblical evidence or mandate or anything for the worship of Sunday. In fact, when you look at it just kind of even from a textual, statistical standpoint, you have 8 references at most to Sunday in the New Testament. The whole of the New Testament.
Wow.
8.
Wow.
There's 9 references to the Sabbath just in the book of Acts alone.
Wow.
So of those 8, 5 of them are the same event. They're basically just saying people went to the tomb on Sunday when Jesus rose from the grave. Wow. So that's in all the Gospels, right? And so you're basically, if 5 of them are the same event, you have 8 total. You're talking about 4 different things total, right? So in history, though, when you had the first century church, this is the apostolic church, right? And after that, within the first 100 years that the church existed, they were different. And the Romans actually were very religiously tolerant. But the Romans had big problems with the Jews, right? Because the Jews were always stirring up things, hated the Romans, always pushing back, right? So even though the Romans were religiously tolerant, they didn't like the Jews. okay, so if you're a Christian and you're worshiping on the Sabbath and you don't eat this, and you eat the same kind of foods as the Jews,
Like no pork and
right?
no alcohol.
So if you're following many of the same ideals, you're easily confused with the Jews, whom the Romans hate. So what happens? Well, over time, they start to distance themselves from the Jews by making compromises in their beliefs.
Yeah.
One of those beliefs was the day that they worshiped on.
Yeah.
And there were different schools of thought depending on where you were at in the area around Israel and Palestine. So you have the Alexandrian school of thought, you have the Antioch school of thought, and it's like different ones went down at different times, and different areas rose up as I guess places of influence and power. It's like why you later on you have the Bishop of Rome being a prominent figure, because Rome became a center of influence and power.
Wow.
So along with that wasn't just the day of worship, it was also dietary things. Christians started eating differently than their Jewish brothers and sisters, because they didn't want to be confused and receive that persecution and hatred that the Romans bestowed upon the Jewish people.
Yeah, I mean, we see where the Constantine came in, right? Emperor Constantine in Rome.
He was a pagan.
He was a pagan. He became a Christian due to some vision or dream of, I think it was like a cross or
before
something
that, he was
saw.
persecuting Christians, right?
Yes, he was persecuting Christians before. So he had this dream of this cross, and this is all historical knowledge. But he therefore is like, well, I guess I got to be a Christian now, because the Christian God gave me the victory over this battle that I'm about to fight, or was about to fight. And so he says, well, the whole nation needs to be Christian. And obviously there were people who were keeping the Sabbath, and there were the pagans who were keeping Sunday in honor of the sun god, which was the first day of the week, because up until that point, Christians were still keeping the biblical Sabbath, which was Friday evening sunset till Saturday evening sunset.
The fourth commandment.
The fourth commandment, yes. And so for him to make it easier to draw the pagans in, he said, well, let's just allow it. You worship God on Sunday. And first it was Sabbath and Saturday and Sunday. And like Keith was explaining, due to the anti-Semitism, eventually Sunday became more popular. And over the course of centuries, we've forgotten all about it. But it's the only commandment in the 10 Commandments that says, remember, right? So like God knew we were going to forget. So that's why this is something that's important for us to discuss, and why we have James here, because, we have this issue of this push to worship only on Sunday and to do away with Sabbath keeping.
Well, what I think is interesting about Constantine, I remember reading where he said Judaizers would be persecuted. So like Keith was saying, you separate yourself from the Jews. So the Christians were like, okay, yeah, we're going to keep Sunday. And he said that all shops must be closed. You have to honor the venerable day of the sun. So if there was some anti-Christ agenda to, to enforce worship on a worldwide scale, and to deceive the world into worshiping a different day, and to break God's commandments.
Yeah.
So what do you think this is headed prophetically, or what's the danger? I mean, what are you predicting? If this were to happen tomorrow, what would our close future look like?
We're not even talking about tomorrow. What we're talking about is starting January 1, or
Next
whenever
year.
the president takes office, which is, around, I think, January 19 or 2021, something like that. 2025, that's essentially when the clock starts ticking. And again, I think it depends on who winds up in the Oval Office. If it's a Republican, I think this thing is a slam dunk.
I think one of the things that's going to drive us this direction too is you look at the narrative in popular culture and media today. I don't know if you guys saw the trailer for that new movie, Civil War,
I
but
haven't seen it.
there's a discussion now
Oh, yeah,
increasingly in the United States about this idea that we might be headed towards a second Civil War. Just how divided our nation is. And there's also a lot of discussion about famine as far as that goes. Now, if you combine civil war and famine, if you go back to the fish markets in the French Revolution and some of the driving factors of what pushed people to violence and a coercive state, you take away somebody's food, that's going to push them to extremes. There's a lot of factors that could drive this and make it really happen really quickly.
Well, on that note, we are wrapping up today's show. You know, this is, again, not a discussion of politics saying this party is something you should vote for, or this party. But we are seeing prophecy being fulfilled in Project 2025. And like we've discussed, this is an issue of religious freedom. Whether you are a Sabbath-keeping Christian of various denominations that keep the Sabbath, whether you are a Muslim, whether you are a Jew, whether you're of any other religion, or whether you're a Sunday-keeping Christian, this is attacking your religious freedom. And so we encourage you, go to your Bible, look it up, understand the prophecies, dig deep, and understand where this is headed, right? And also speak up and take it into prayer when you go and vote for a new president. Ask the Lord, whom should I vote for, or should I perhaps withhold from voting? And then believe that God will lead you in that. And besides that, stay close to Jesus. Stay in prayer, stay in the word, so that no matter what happens and may fall upon us, Jesus says that he will never leave us nor forsake us, because we want to be true to God's word. As the Reformer said in the Dark Ages, sola scriptura, by the scriptures and the scriptures alone. And that is our stance. We want to stand by the scriptures and the scriptures alone. And we all here want to worship God as we believe the scriptures have told us, though the heavens may fall. And we hope that that is your decision as well. If you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. We're here every single Friday at 12 p.m. ET with a new show. We also got videos coming out during the week. We also got a podcast. If you want to dive deep into anything from the Bible or prophecy, look up the Little Light Studios podcast. Mikey also has a new YouTube channel. Well, Little Light has a new YouTube channel, and Mikey is managing it. What is it, Mikey?
We have Little Light Kids. If you got little ones and you don't want them exposed to the things that the world is just throwing at them, we're putting out content as much as we can. We want to put out biblical, safe content for your little ones. So check that out at Little Light Kids.
Also, if you want to share your faith and support our ministry, you can do so by getting a t-shirt, or in this case, Keith is wearing a hoodie, quite ironically, about the creation and the seventh day, right? So you can get that on lightwear.shop. If you want to support our ministry financially, we really, really appreciate that. We are so appreciative of all of our donors. You can go to patreon.com/littlelightstudios or to lls.tv/give. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
If you're looking for good, wholesome, educational content for your children, subscribe to our new channel, Little Light Kids.